Director William Friedkin's 1977 thriller Sorcerer is an adaptation of director Georges Arnaud's French novel The Wages of Fear, and tells the story of four vastly different men tossed about by fate and fighting to retake control of their own destinies when given a dangerous opportunity, only to find that they're in less control of their lives than they ever thought possible. As a follow-up to his back-to-back critical and commercial successes of The French Connection and The Exorcist, Friedkin's Sorcerer is brutal, uncompromising, unkind to both character and audience. Unlike the source material or its first film adaptation, Sorcerer begins with 4 vignettes highlighting the men we will soon come to know. Nilo, played by Francisco Rabal, receives the shortest focus, assassinating a man in Veracruz. Amidou is Qassem, a Palestinian militant who escapes capture after a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. Victor Manzon, played by Bruno Cremer, leaves his wealthy life in France and his wife behind before he can be imprisoned for fraud. And Roy Scheider is Jackie Scanlon, a New Jersey gangster on the run from rival mobsters after a church heist goes wrong. Each of these men finds themselves in the South American town of Porvenir, the one place they can find anonymity and safety amidst brutal poverty, when the local oil well explodes, erupting into a hellmouth of endless fire. The 4 men are selected to transport highly sensitive, nitroglycerin-leaking dynamite to cap the well and save the town that depends on it. But even the slightest jostle could kill them in an instant. Ahead of them lies 200 miles of rough road and, at the end of it, enough money to release them from this purgatory and return to better lives. Unlike director Henri-Georges Clouzot's 1953 adaptation of The Wages of Fear, Waylon Green's script for Sorcerer is less about the effects of capitalism and greed, and more about whether anyone truly has control over his or her own life. Each of these men is running from their doom to some degree, yet continually pulled back toward death no matter how hard they struggle. This is fate. Regarding its title, Friedkin said, "The sorcerer was an evil wizard, and in this case the evil wizard was fate. The Exorcist was about faith, and this was about fate, in the lives of 4 different guys who really screwed up." In its filmmaking style, characters, score, and underlying themes regarding the forces beyond our control, Sorcerer ponders whether we have any true power over our own fates, and definitively, aggressively answers, no. As the challenges mount, the absurdity of the world and the nearness of death are revealed to Sorcerer's characters, forcing them to question whether there is any greater meaning to life. This paradox of the absurd was defined by philosopher Albert Camus in his 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, in which Camus argues that the search for meaning in life is ultimately futile, as there is none. The world has no rationality or reason, and realizing this causes an existential crisis. Yet Camus argues that life must be fought for, and in accepting the absurdity of life, we can become happy through our contentment in continual struggle akin to the Greek mythological figure of Sisyphus. Sorcerer is the process through which this absurdity is revealed. Narratively, Friedkin's film handles its characters dispassionately. There is a lack of sympathy extended to them in the way that obstacle after obstacle presents itself as almost matter of fact. These are bad men, more or less, killers and thieves whose choices have brought them here. Yet the cruelty of their increasingly desperate situation begins to elicit our sympathy. The characters themselves are exasperated by the constant dangers thrown their way, but Friedkin places them in the road ahead as simply yet another deadly moment in the continual tightrope walk of life. This is fate. Fate has no sympathy, it takes no rest. Likewise, the pace of Sorcerer and Friedkin's direction do not know rest or care. Before setting its characters off on their journey, the first hour of Sorcerer is focused on their life in Latin America. The fictional town of Porvenir has no specific country, no exact real-world counterpart, but the involvement of an American oil company that looks past a dictatorial government and extreme poverty reflects truth. Friedkin lingers on the dirt and the sweat, the inability to escape the gaping maws of poverty. This is Purgatory. Its central characters have been cast here for their sins and bide their time as penance, while caught in a limbo between the life they once lived and the deaths from which they are running. The 4 weary characters stay in the Purgatory of Porvenir can be equated to what Camus calls the act of eluding, putting off facing the meaninglessness of life in hopes of finding something to believe in. When the oil well explodes, the apocalyptic fire it creates becomes an opening in the gates of purgatory through which these men can escape. But are they escaping into heaven or into hell? So much of Sorcerer's focus is devoted to work, the process, the grind needed to get something done, the Sisyphean fight against an uncompromising world. This is a journey of 200 miles, but every step feels like a fight when there's dynamite strapped to your back. Close-ups by cinematographers John M. Stevens and Dick Bush show us the sweat pouring off our leads, feet punching the gas and brake, hands grappling with constantly shifting gears. It's unrelenting, and it only gets worse as the world itself seems determined to destroy our characters. At the time I made the film, said Friedkin, I felt that the world had come to a crossroads, where the major powers would all blow apart if we didn't pull together. Life is actually a beautiful gift, but people regard it not as something that is vulnerable, but as something that they take for granted. Alfred Hitchcock once explained the difference between surprise and suspense in film. Surprise is a bomb suddenly going off under a table without warning. Suspense is the audience knowing that the bomb is under the table and set to blow, but unable to warn the characters on screen. Sorcerer is overflowing with suspense because both audience and characters know that the dynamite carried in the trucks could go off at any moment for any reason, but are unable to do anything about it. We watch Sorcerer in constant fear of death, yet have no ability to predict when it might finally come to take us away. When it does, it's so unpredictable and simple that it's a devastating surprise. This is death. We're not all driving a truck across a rope bridge, but allegorically we are, said Friedkin. Whether you take that as disease or family problems or things that come out of nowhere like hurricanes and earthquakes and fires, that as we speak are making us think about the apocalypse again. Sorcerer's quiet first half contemplates death and despair, giving way to a second half where the ever-encroaching specter of death amplifies that despair. A brittle wooden road, rainstorms, mercenaries, a felled tree, and, most importantly, a rope bridge over a raging river. All these obstacles are presented suddenly and staunchly in the path of the narrative. Green's script has no foreshadowing of what's to come, no shift in pacing to hint toward a treacherous twist. The way that Friedkin and his editors cut the film rams straight into the next obstacle without slowing down, and as soon as one danger has been bypassed, the film immediately cuts to the next situation without a pause for breath. When its characters celebrate or reminisce, they find themselves in even worse danger because they mistakenly believe that the world has given them a break. Late in the film, our two trucks come to a fork in the road and go their separate ways. Jackie and Nilo feel like they made the right choice, but are quickly forced to drive over a rope bridge in the middle of a storm, carefully guiding the tires across slowly breaking planks. It's a death-defying, harrowing sequence, but they make it. They celebrate, and we as an audience feel like we can breathe again, only to smash cut to Manzone and Kassem at the same bridge. It didn't matter what path they took. Fate led them to the same place. Crossing a more broken bridge in an even worse storm fries the nerves of both character and audience as we repeat the fight to survive with even worse circumstances. Each character reacts to these unceasing obstacles in their own ways, but are all worn down in mind and body. Scanlan in particular experiences hellish delusions near the very end. None of us truly have complete control over our own lives when even the simplest actions of another person can take a life. The novel read by Manzone's wife at the start brings this directly to our attention. When I lowered my hand, the cannon would commence firing. I saw a woman carrying a jar on her head. In seconds, my gesture would remove her from this world. Whose gesture would remove me? When and how? These realizations force us to confront what we believe about life, but we instinctually fight for our next breath, even as we begin to question whether life is truly worth living. As Camus said, in a man's attachment to life, there is something stronger than all the ills in the world. The body's judgment is as good as the mind's, and the body shrinks from annihilation. We get into the habit of living before we acquire the habit of thinking. In that race which daily hastens us toward death, the body maintains its irreparable lead. As Scanlan carries the dynamite by foot for the last 2 miles of this journey, his body guides him long after his mind has gone out of sheer desperation to live. Despite its title, Sorcerer lacks any supernatural elements. No magic, no demons, nothing that can't be explained as cruel reality. But Friedkin still imbues his story with something otherworldly bubbling just beneath the surface. A dark pulse that feels like fate playing with the puppet strings on our main characters. Friedkin opens his film on a close-up of an ancient, monstrous statue that seems incongruous when followed by the 4 vignettes. But we return to that statue an hour later, buried into the wall found at the start of the nitroglycerin journey. This deadly task has been waiting for our 4 men from the very start. The grinning jaws and round eyes of the statue are reflected in the animalistic design of one of the 2 trucks, the titular Sorcerer itself. The second is named Lazaro, Spanish for Lazarus. The men that drive it wish to return from the dead like the biblical namesake, but these vehicles instead end up being the means of their destruction. It's not a coincidence that when the worst seems behind them, it's Sorcerer that explodes from a blown tire. This tinge of supernatural is underlined by the haunting electronic score by Tangerine Dream. Its inorganic feel creates an ethereal atmosphere. At times, it enforces its character's bravery. At others, it feels like a shrieking demon casting a spell. Large swaths of the film go unscored, instead focusing on the sounds of the jungle and the people toiling away. When it does kick in, Tangerine Dream's music makes moments like the reveal of the burning oil well, or the creation of the trucks, feel monumental and almost spiritual. Possibly even more frightening than the idea of fate is that this cruel, terrible, deadly journey is simply the result of an indifferent world. The obstacles and dangers put in the path of the trucks aren't something supernatural designed to cause death, but simply the result of a broken world where each individual's struggle really only matters to a small handful of people. Reflecting on Sorcerer, Friedkin said, "Nobody had anything to say about their birth, or death, or time of death, or anything else. The ending is the same for all of us." Ironically, Friedkin's film had about as much control over its fate as its characters. Dismissive reviews and the explosive debut of Star Wars made Sorcerer look like a film from a bygone era. Even worse, audiences walked out due to the use of foreign language at the start and mistakenly expecting that a film titled Sorcerer from the director of The Exorcist would be high fantasy. Sorcerer, for all intents and purposes, was dead on arrival. Along with the contemporary failings of Heaven's Gate, New York, and others, it was the short, painful death rattle of the 70s auteur movement known as New Hollywood that reinvigorated film, only to die as the era of the blockbuster began. "There is no love of life without despair of life," said Camus. Sorcerer is all despair. There is no chance for reflection after the epiphany of how cruel the world truly is. By Sorcerer's end, we're left with Scanlan triumphant but haunted by what he's experienced. The truth about life and the indifferent, callous world has been revealed to him in one long, unflinching close-up on Scheider's face. He's hollowed out by surviving so much out of pure chance. Like Sisyphus, Scanlan is conscious of the futility of life and his actions. In that moment is the true tragedy of Sorcerer, which is quickly followed by contentment, and once again by inevitable tragedy. This is death. It's all around us. This is fate. It has no care for us. What comes at Sorcerer's very end is not so much a final, cruel twist, but the world's final assertion of its power over all our lives. No matter how hard we fight to survive, the next struggle still awaits us. This is the world.